Yeah. Good to see you. We're going to be doing this is the third week, in case you have lost track, this is the third week of our 4-week class. We are going to be talking today, at the end of today's talk, weather permitting, we're going to go on a little walking tour around town. It'll be about half a mile. If anybody isn't able to go, I'll send out a list of the locations so that if you're driving around, you can see them. So if anybody doesn't fill out the talk or put it in text. So I just want to take a second to congratulate one of our classmates, Claire McNaught. She did the Tuesday talk this morning, and she did an excellent job. You guys were there, right? Yeah. She did a wonderful job. Yeah, so it was very good. And just as a reminder, we do every second Tuesday, we have a talk right here in this building at 10:30. And it can be as formal or as informal as you like. We are always looking for people who would like to speak. Basically, it's anything related to Southport history or the surrounding area, and whatever. It can be something that you just feel comfortable talking about off the top of your head, or you can make a PowerPoint slide. And if you want to do a talk but you're not sure what topic you might like to talk about, talk to me, talk to Bob Surge. I'm sure we can help you come up with a topic. And if you know you want to do a talk, just talk to Bob Surge. He schedules the talks. And if you don't, if you're not ready yet to do a talk, we certainly welcome you to come once a month and hear them. The next slide, I was going to mention, I don't see Lo Davis here.
She's sick.
She's sick. Well, she's probably worn out. I was just going to mention that Lo Davis was not here last week because it was election day and she was running for public office and she won. So, congratulations, Lo. And I said, yeah, sorry that it, made you sick. So, let's see.
So do you know what the topic of next month's Tuesday talk is?
Historical markers.
It is historical markers.
In Brunswick County Historical Markers. Pat Kirkman, who's the current vice president of the society and a really good, entertaining speaker, will be doing that presentation.
She is. She's calling it history on a stick.
Volume controls shown. Swipe up to dismiss.
Oh, it's talking again.
This is why I'm muting her, because she keeps talking, but I just have something I want to play for you guys. Next Sunday there's going to be a fundraiser at Mount Carmel AME Church. I'm going to play. There we go. It's a 60-second video just to put you in the. Wanting more, because it does for me. There will be, so their fundraiser on Sunday is going to be, there's going to be gospel music, there's going to be them praising Muppets, don't know what that is, but it's not, and then a gospel comedian. It's for the Mount Carmel Church. It's a very historic church here in town. The original building was actually from the Trinity Church that's across from the post office, and that was built in the 1800s. Bob, do you remember the year?
Late 1800s, yeah.
Late 1800s. Then when they went to go build a new church, because this is Southport, they moved the old church. They sold it to the African American congregation. They rolled it on logs as they do. They moved it over, and then that was the foundation for that church. They were damaged very badly during Florence, and they're still working to recover. So that's, I'm just going to make sure I have this unmuted. That is that. And if you want tickets, Whitfield.Griffin, or you can call a Gmail, or you can call the church. I think I just saw Fred come in. Did I? There you go. The next, you're on this committee, right? The Southport Forestry Committee?
Yes.
I saw your name on the website. If you remember last week, I told you I had asked Scott Glenn about information for the, about the tree next to the Brunswick Community College, and he was nice enough to go out and measure the tree, and give us an estimate, and do all sorts of calculations to say that it's very old. He also, he did the math to prove it. He mentioned to me that, to let you guys know, there is a meeting, the second Tuesdays of the month, there is a meeting about the Forestry Committee, and people are welcome to come. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's today at 5.
Today at 5. But it's every month, right? So if they're interested. And my question is, how many towns, I mean, you don't know this, but how many towns the size of Southport have a forestry committee? I would think that's rare.
I don't know, but we've been a tree city, I think, for
Since
15
2004.
Yeah, 15 years. Yeah, it's an important part of our town, so
Yeah.
I know it's important to Wilmington and other places like that, but we take it pretty seriously.
What makes you a tree city?
So if we maintain a certain amount of coverage of tree canopy, we've got, if we were to cut down all the trees, we would, or if we were to take away, I think right now we're at like 66% canopy cover,
Wow.
which exceeds their requirements. And then there's education and so forth that the forestry committee is required to do to stay up with it.
It's really important, and I think it's unique to, I mean, the trees have always been important to Southport, historically important to Southport, and you see that as you go through the history. And we'll, on our tour today, we'll also be pointing out a few of the better known trees in Southport, because there are so many trees. So some of the ones that I showed you last week, we'll be seeing today. Okay, following up on a few questions from last week. Remember we were talking last week about the gym, the Southport, the city gym, and that half the money had gone to another town. We thought it was Whiteville, built the gym, so we have half the gym, and we thought somewhere out there was another half of the gym. I did some digging. I don't have a definitive answer. I believe it might be the Whiteville Rec Center. I did send an email to the person in charge of that, but I haven't heard back from him. But they have this picture on their website of showing the nice new floor that they had done. And I mean, I don't know about basketball courts, but that one looks kind of small to me. So I'm thinking maybe that's where the other half of the gym went, is over to the Whiteville Rec Center. But I will continue to pursue this burning question until we have an absolute answer. Right, half the money went to another gym. So we'll be seeing that building today on our walking tour. We'll be seeing the gym just from the outside. Another question we had last week that I wasn't sure of was the origin of the name for the Ku Klux Klan. And so I looked into it. No one seems to have a definitive answer, but the common belief is that it was based on the Greek word kuklus. There was a popular fraternity in the South at that time called the Ku Klux Adelphin, which stands for Circle of Brotherhood fraternity. So it stands to reason they couldn't pull the circle word Ku Klux out and made it. So that seems to be the prevailing theory. Nobody really seems to have an alternate theory or any other explanation as to why they would be using the Greek word for circle. In case anybody's curious, that picture there, that photograph, that was taken in the 60s.
In this county.
In this county, no, I don't believe it was in this county, no.
I think it's a grant for it.
I should have looked to see what county it was. I actually got that from David Selski's page, his blog, and it was from when he was growing up, from where he grew up, and I'm sorry, but not here.
Somebody told me that the original city where it started was Whiteville
No, the clan started in Tennessee.
in Tennessee.
And Pulaski, Tennessee, I think. There were six Confederates that got together and started it, and then it just sort of flashed. I'm not sure exactly what the goal was when they started it, but I'm sure that it was beyond, this was beyond what they had in mind. Okay, another question that I got was about membership. Some people were talking that they would like to join the society, of course we'd love to have you, but that they were concerned if they joined now, that the membership would only last until December, and then they'd have to join, pay another due in January. And that's not the way it works. From September 1st on, if you join the Historical Society, your dues will carry over for the whole next year. So if you were to join now, you would be paying dues that would last until December of 2020. So it's actually a deal because you're getting extra time. The membership is $15 for an individual, it's $25 for a couple, and there's some membership brochures over there on the table, plus I gave you one the first day. So you're welcome to join if you're interested and help support things like this class and the monuments that we do and all the other things we do around Southport to research and share Southport history. Another question I got was about the population of Southport. What was the definitive population? And we can't tell definitively because it's not a census year. We're pretty far from the census, so we're doing a new census next year. Hopefully in 2021 we'll have a number. From what I could find from the government census site, the estimated population of Southport in 2018 was 3,800. And 100 years ago, it was 1,500. Now, the reason that isn't an exact comparison is because the boundaries of Southport have grown. So this is from Google. This is where Google thinks the boundary of Southport is. You've got a larger area in the city proper, then you've got an area around Walmart, which seems pretty lucrative from a tax basis. Then the part that Google doesn't have, but the government site had, is up behind Walgreens. There's a subdivision, an area called, I think, River Mist. Is that the one there?
SK is called River Mist without River.
Yeah, River Mist is down to 11.
All right, I thought it was, that's where the government had it, it was behind Walgreens. They had it wrong, okay. Well, there's another area, and I believe it is River Mist, that is included in Southport.
That's behind the Bojangles.
Okay. All right, so that's
The
where that is.
landmarks.
That's where that is. So that's where the 3,800 people are spread out more than they would have been back 100 years ago. So what's more helpful for our discussion today would be to compare Smithfield Township, the population of Smithfield Township between now and 100 years ago. So the line, the dark red line there, that's Smithfield Township. So that includes Oak Island and St. James and all of the, Arbor Creek and all of those places. So the estimate right now is about 18,000, which feels right. But in 1918, 100 years ago, it was 3,000 in the entire township. So we had 1,500 people in Southport, and then spread throughout the rest of the township was only another 1,500 people. So it just underscores how isolated Southport was, which I just kind of want you to keep in mind as we go through today's topic. I think it'll help, just kind of help imagine what was going on for the people there. So our topic for today is World War on the Shores of Southport. And I'm really pleased to be doing this topic today after Veterans Day. Yesterday marked the 101st anniversary of the end of World War I. And I'm sure you agree it's important to remember the people that sacrificed for us. And I think that today's topic we're going to be talking about some lesser known aspects of the wars and about and of life in Southport 100 years ago. So, as we said, we'll be talking about 100 years ago. The World War I actually started in 1914 in Europe, the European War. But we didn't become involved until 1917. And I think it's easy for us to forget how controversial our involvement was. It was the very first time in our country's history that we sent U.S. troops overseas to defend foreign soil. It was a huge deal, and it took several years to get to that point, and a lot of opposing views for that to happen. So a little bit about Southport 100 years ago. And we already know some things from our previous classes. So we know that Southport was a dry town, but that there were probably still some stills in the woods if you went and looked for them. We know that the Brunswick County Training School had not yet been built, but that the graded school in Franklin Park was about 10 years old. We know that Southport was the county seat. We had the county jail that we saw last week, and the courthouse. So now some things maybe we don't know. But even though women didn't yet have the right to vote in the U.S., they were bringing their influence into Southport. So in 1909, they had started a civic club. And they got to work right away, because that's what women do, get down to business. They got the businesses in town to stop throwing their trash into the streets. That's a big thing. They got barrels. Then after they got them to throw it into barrels, they took it a step at a time. After they got them to throw it into barrels, they got them to move the barrels behind the businesses so the barrels weren't sitting right out in front. Those were big things. They started planting some flowers in town, some flowering bushes, trying to clean up the place, make it look a little better. They encouraged people to clean up their own yards, maybe plant some gardens. They held some little contests so people would be motivated to do that. They did the same thing with the cemetery. They had little contests, tried to encourage people to clean up their lots, their family lots. They sewed curtains for the graded school so that the children didn't have the sun glaring in. And they started the town's first library. And that was in the Garrison House at Fort Johnson. It was in the East Wing. And they even paid for the librarian. So, and if you look closely here, in this picture, that's a street light. That's the town's first street light, and that was paid for by the women's club. And so, if you imagine, it was all dark. They had the street light.
Is that, do you have a reference for what street that is?
I want to say dry and...
I think it was near the Chapel of the Cross. And the
Oh, you think
courthouse.
it was, okay, that's what you think it was more and dry, okay. I meant to look it up.
Floor Street building.
I think that's the hospital building there right now, the free market.
Oh, yeah, so that would make
And
sense.
the one across the Moore Street building.
Yeah, it would be.
Then that, yes, okay, so then that is,
And Davis.
that makes sense. That makes sense, because this is, I believe this is looking down more and then both ways down more. The top one is looking that way. Okay, and the other thing they did, they were trying to, yes,
Is it still there?
Yeah.
the
The brick building's a flea market.
No,
The light.
the
light.
It'd be in the middle of the road. Yeah, it's in the middle of the road. Yeah, I don't think, there's no meaning there. The other thing they did is they were really trying to encourage the health of babies and children. They did some education on how to better care for babies and things like that. And so, as part of that, they had hosted an annual baby parade. And so they put their babies in buggies and parade them around, and everybody got to see what a nice job they were doing raising their children. So that civic club that they started still exists today in Southport, and it's known as the Southport Women's Club. So they've done many, many things for Southport, and they still do. Yes, Lisa?
It's my understanding that they hand-painted the first street signs, the names on the signs. I read that in...
Yeah, they were trying to hire it out. They decided they needed street signs, and then they ended up stenciling them themselves. Yeah, there were some early street signs. Okay. This was,
Liz, when was that? I'm thinking,
well,
I've always heard the story that they got the first street signs when they began home delivery.
That,
which
that's
was in
why I
the
was
60s.
hesitating, I know. They were the streets, they were making some street signs, because they talked about it in their minutes. They were making some street signs early on, like in the
Early on.
first decade of existence. I don't know what happened to those. I know that people did not, I know Judy was here, I know people did not use the signs to tell where they lived. Nobody said, I live on Caswell Street, or I live on such and such a street. They had these words. They would say, I live in the alley, I live out west, I'm trying to remember the ones she's told me. But there's like different areas. People would, that's how they didn't have numbers, and they didn't use the streets.
Right, so the numbers and the
The
later
numbers came
street
much
signs
later.
came in the 60s when they had started home delivery.
Yeah, and those were the street signs that were like little white pillars, they're like little posts.
We had,
Yeah, that's what they had, that's what they put in the 60s. But the Women's Club did some kind of street signs early on. But I don't know how many, and I'm not sure whether anybody paid any attention to it. So this is the Miller Hotel and Cafe. It was a very popular establishment at the time, and it was on the corner of Hallam Bay Street. It's not there anymore, but it was very well run. This is the Steward Inn. It's out on the waterfront. Now, if you were at the jail last week, you'll remember Nancy mentioned that the land that the jail was on was purchased from Kate Stewart. So Kate Stewart owned this inn. She sold the land to the city for $400 for the jail. And I mentioned Kate before, she also was one of the first teachers at the Smithfield Academy. After the Civil War, when they had to start up schooling again and stuff, she was one of the first teachers.
Liz, what house are you talking about?
Which one?
On the right.
This one is the Stewart Inn. Yes, sir.
To take it back a minute.
Oh, you want to go back?
We just had it donated to us today. It is the historic Southport, North Carolina City Directory of 1963, which I'm convinced in my mind was produced because of the home delivery of mail. So now you have a number and a street for your house.
And if Judy were here, Judy worked at the post office, and she said that's when she first learned really what the streets were and started doing that, and because people didn't use them. And when she would go back and talk to people, you know, that she knew, friends and family and stuff, if she referred to something by the street name, they're like, I don't know where that is. And so she'd have to say, you know, and they had names for the little neighborhoods, and then up, you know, and landmarks, and you go by this, kind of what we were saying behind Bojangles or whatever. That's how they would tell us stuff. It was a learning curve to come up with using the actual addresses and numbers on the streets. It's sort of novelty, like, oh, okay. Oh, I asked her how she got mail, and so people got mail. They didn't have delivery of mail, so they either had post office boxes, or the mail went to general delivery, and you just went in and asked for it. Little side thing there. The Stewart Inn. This is a view from the Kate Stewart, the inn, looking out. And as we said, it was the county seat. So the county court met here, I think once a month. So whenever court was in session, the judges and the lawyers preferred to stay at the Stewart Inn. She was a gracious hostess. She was known for the food that she served, a lot of dishes she created herself. That she was known for being a very good conversationalist. She was very well educated. She read a lot. She was very interested in politics and business, and so she was a wonderful hostess and really just a landmark in Southport. Icon. Landmark probably not a good word for a woman. But anyway, I could do a whole class on history. Another prominent person in town was Dr. Dosher. Now, at the time that we're talking about, 100 years ago, there was no hospital in all of Brunswick County. Use your mind around that. But we were fortunate enough to have a very well-respected local man. He grew up here. Family lived here for generations. He went away to college in Maryland, became a doctor, came back, and to be a doctor in his hometown. And he was very highly regarded, and he was very skilled, and he would perform surgery, sometimes complicated surgery, on his kitchen table or on other people's kitchen tables. And including brain surgery at one point, and the patient lived. Lived a full life. He also would hold an annual tonsil clinic at the quarantine station where the children would all, you know, that was the thing to do back then. The children would all get their tonsils out, and then he had like teenage girls that would volunteer for, or maybe he paid them. But anyway, they would serve ice cream to the children when they recovered. So most people live there, earn their living on the water. This is the waterfront along where the park is now. It was a working waterfront. It was not all a park setting like it is now. It was very much a working industrial area. Menhaden, or pogie fishing as they call it, was a very big business. Now that fish, they would catch a lot of it. It was no good for eating. But it was excellent fertilizer. So there were several fisheries, fish factories in town, and what they would do is grind up the fish and package it up as meal, you know, fertilizer that would be sent. Sometimes they would use it to feed as hog food. They'd feed the hogs, but they found out if you pass it through the hog first and then use that, that was also good fertilizer. So that was going on around. There were some people who complained about the smell. Apparently, menhaden smell very, very bad, and then you grind them up, and then the wind, if the wind is blowing towards Southport.
Menhaden was actually caught for its oil ability because it was using cosmetics and stuff.
Okay, that was another
big
usage
deal.
of it.
That's what it is. That song you're talking about, and the smell of the menhaden was money in Southport.
Exactly, I was going to say, people would say, you know, they complain, they say, hush your mouth, that's the smell of money.
Yeah.
So they squeeze the oil out and use it for one thing, and then
Yeah,
use the
yeah,
leftovers
yeah, some
for
kind of
fertilizer.
boiler or something.
Yeah, I don't know all the
Yeah.
details of how
It
they
did smell pretty bad.
processed it, yeah. So, at that time, until the 60s, African American men were not allowed to be boat captains. But they were welcome to be the labor force on the Menhaden boat, so they were the main force for that. It was very difficult labor, very backbreaking, and what they're doing here is they caught a bunch of menhaden in nets. There's a couple boats put together, they call it a purse boat, and they would, they're pulling the nets, it's called hardening the catch, and so they're trying to drag the water out and pull the fish in. It's extremely hard labor, and so what they would do to kind of distract themselves from the work and also to coordinate their efforts is that they would sing sea shanties as they were working. And when the wind was blowing right, you could hear the singing on the shore.
Is that fish extinct now?
No.
It's been overfished though, it's not
Right.
extinct, but it's,
There's one fish factory left on the East Coast, and that's Norfolk,
not
Virginia.
my understanding though is that it actually was kind of a critical component to the ecosystem and the food chain, and we sort of overfished it and it caused some consequences, so.
No.
But anyway, so that was a major source of employment and money in the community. Another one was the shrimp houses. And these are some shrimp houses on these docks here. And that was another source of employment. This is the river tower as they had for decades. The river pilots watched for large ships. They would, when they saw them, they would row out to the ships, they would go out to the ships and meet them, and then they would board the ship. The pilot would take over from the captain and navigate the boat up the river because there were no depth gauges then, and the river was very shallow in spots. There were hazards. There were other sunken boats in the river, so they would navigate it through for the captains and take it up to Wilmington. The waterfront wasn't all work. There was this pavilion, that great big building here, that was the pavilion, and it was used for dances and events and music and things like that. So people did have fun when they weren't working. The roads were still unpaved. They were dirt, basically. There were sand spurs everywhere. They did attempt to improve them some by putting shells down, like oyster shells and things, but they weren't. They didn't. It was mostly dirt. And as you can see, the main modes of transportation was either walking or horse-drawn wagons. We had, after absolutely decades of effort by the leaders of the town, the railroad had finally arrived. And this is a picture from the grand opening. So this is in 1911, the railroad came to town, and this line was called the WB&S, which officially stood for Wilmington, Brunswick, and Southern. But the locals all said WB&S stood for willing but slow. It was never a really great mode of transportation to Wilmington, but it did try. But it couldn't compete with the steamship. So cars had come to town. The first car in Southport that ever was seen in Southport was in 1910. We know this because it got written up in the paper. And it was somebody from South Carolina brought some people who had family here, brought them up to visit. And after last week's talk about prohibition and moonshine, I have to wonder if they also didn't maybe stick the bottles in that they brought up from South Carolina. So that was in 1910, and but then within the next few years, people did start to get some cars, and they started to see them, but they were still not the primary mode at that point. And part of the reason was that the roads were not that good. They just weren't as convenient. This road here is Southport Supply Road. So the next time you're complaining about the road, all right, so the main method was the steamboat, and it went every day between Wilmington and Southport. It took about 3 hours each way, and it would take passengers, and it would also deliver the mail. And the people would wait on the pier. Again, this is King Stewart's over there, and then there's the pier, and they're all waiting either to go on the boat or to meet friends that are coming. So that gives you an idea of what Southport was like back then. It was small, it was isolated, it was just, they were just living their life, but things were starting to change, and they would be changing for Southport because of things going on in Europe. And so, you know, it's time to lock up your daughters because the army was coming to town. So nowadays, we tend to forget. We get accustomed to sending troops overseas. You know, there's not much of space between when we decide, oh, we need to send troops overseas, and then we can send troops overseas. But we forget that there was a time when the U.S. did not keep a standing army. In fact, there was great opposition to keeping a standing army. So when the war started coming in mid-1915, it's hard to say the teens there. We didn't have that much army. So this graph shows how many soldiers, how many troops these different countries had. So you can see in Russia they had nearly 6 million troops. In Germany they had nearly 5 million. In France they had nearly 4 million. In Austria almost 2 million. In Italy a little over 1 million. England had 600,000. Serbia had around 200,000. Belgium had around 200,000. And Montenegro had 50,000. So if you were going to add a little U.S. soldier, a little doughboy, on this chart, where would you think he would be? How many troops do you think we had? Any ideas? We had some.
Between Serbia and England?
Between Serbia and England, okay. So pretty much where everybody would guess, between Serbia and England? Yeah. Yeah, it would be more like between Belgium and Montenegro.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We had about 200,000 troops if you included the National Guard. So it was, we really had very, very little. Yeah. And if you think about it, building up troops, that's a huge logistical challenge. I mean, we had to get everybody registered, we had to create a draft, we had to create criteria for who was in, who was out, who passed the draft, who didn't, what they were going to do with them. We had to figure out where to train them. We had to get uniforms for them and weapons for them and figure out how to feed them and then how we were going to get them overseas. And what is phenomenal is we went in a little over a year and a half, 2 years, that was about all the time we were involved in the war, from from 200,000 troops to over 4 million. And 2 million of those went overseas and fought. So one of the places that they trained the troops was here at Fort Caswell. So since the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Fort Caswell only had a small skeleton crew, maybe 50 troops there. But at the start of World War I, there were only 2 training camps in North Carolina. There was Camp Green near Charlotte, and then there was Fort Caswell. So that's all they had. So the first men that got sent there was the National Guard. We did have the National Guard. There were about, I think, 90,000. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, they sent the National Guard to the troops, and then they started sending in ones that they had drafted. So this is a picture of the fort. You can see it's kind of like a little city. There's, there's barracks and there's officers' quarters and there's some other buildings to support that. Like, I don't know, bakery and places where they did stuff. Sorry, I don't know if you did. That's what they had, all the support there. And this is the barracks for the enlisted men. The problem was, though, the barracks only accommodated about 450 men. And the average amount that they had stationed at Fort Caswell was 1,500. So they had to put the overflow into tents, at least for a while, until they could build more barracks. So in the summertime, they had to deal with, the heat. Imagine I was there on Oak Island. They had mosquitoes, sand spurs, just all those things. In the wintertime, the winter of 1918 was one of the coldest on record up to that point. It was a very bad winter. And so they were in the tents, and they heated them with these things called Sibley stoves, which were invented in the Civil War. So this is a picture of the headquarters and the hospital in the back there. This is some of the troops lined up at attention. Until a few weeks ago, they were just, regular Joes, and now they were in the military. These particular troops were actually lucky because you can see they're all wearing uniforms, they all have weapons. The first troops to come, they sent them all notices and said, when you come, it would be really great if you could go and get like a pair of tan pants or some hunting pants and some good boots and bring those. That would be really helpful. If you can't, then at least maybe if you could bring a spare pair of pants and maybe some underwear and socks. Because they said there's going to be a couple weeks before we can get you uniforms. So it was hard to get it all to synchronize all at once. This is the parade ground. You can see the officers' quarters over there to the right and the barracks in the back. And some of the information that I got was from this book here. It's by Ethel Herring. It's Fort Caswell in War and Peace. And in here she said that there was an urgency about the soldiers' stay at Fort Caswell in 1917 to 1918. She says they were desperately needed on the battlefields of Europe. Therefore, the training had to be hurried and intense. And because of the rushed experience, the men were often poorly prepared for what lay ahead. And another thing I'd like to point out, that even though they were in a training camp, they were raw recruits, they were in a training camp, they were still at war. And being in a camp at Fort Caswell is different than being at a camp at, say, Kansas, right? Because the enemy is right at your doorstep. And there were actually a couple instances. There was one night in 1917 where a report came from Baldhead, from the life-saving station over there, the Coast Guard station over there. And they said that their chickens and their livestock had all died. They just had fallen and died. And what they felt was that a submarine had released gas, and that had come across the island and had killed the livestock. And they were telling the fort so they could be on guard. They figured out later what they thought had happened is that the submarine had probably intended to send the gas to Fort Caswell, but the wind shifted and took it over to Baldhead. Following year, in August of 1918, there was another incident, and this time they felt they actually did attack the Coast Guard station and the lighthouse, and it with poison gas, and that 6 people were overcome, including a woman who was the wife of one of the people in charge there. But they were overcome by the fumes. So even though they were training, there were still risks and hazards just by the nature of where they were located. So, but you may be wondering, well, Fort Caswell is over here, and Southport is over there, and we've said there's no roads, there's no road between, there's no bridge, there's no road between Oak Island and Southport at that time. So what difference does it make to Southport if, if there's troops over there? Well, there was a steamer that would come every day, multiple times a day, and would take the troops over to Southport, because when they had liberty, when they needed a little R&R, Southport was where they would go. So again, Southport, small, little, sober fishing village, hardworking, and suddenly there were as many troops, coming over, not all at once, but coming over, as many as there was for every man, woman, and child in Southport. These guys were young, they were away from home for the first time, they were preparing to go overseas, they had a little bit of money because they got paid by the military. Many were worried that they were never going to come home. So when they were on liberty, they wanted to amuse themselves, they wanted to distract themselves, they wanted to comfort themselves. And I can only imagine how worried the town leaders, the mothers must have been with all these troops coming over, and what kind of element it was going to bring, because, military, suddenly they're a military town, and so there tends to be things like, gambling and drinking and, prostitution. So they decided to kind of get ahead of it before those things could happen. And so they set about creating a place that the men could congregate and enjoy wholesome pleasures and not just be wandering the streets of Southport and getting in trouble. So they set up an Army-Navy club, and that was pretty innovative because in World War II we had USOs, but this was kind of a new thing that they came up with. And does anybody recognize that building? Because we've seen it used for other things in previous classes. It's the Masonic Temple being used again, yes, exactly. So there it is. So the people of the town, they donated furniture, decorations, games, a Victrola and records. You can see a piano over there. They provided lots of stationery for riding back home. The Red Cross set up a canteen where they could get cakes and sandwiches. And local women and their daughters would sign up to be hostesses and talk to the troops and stuff in a nice setting. And there was a stage for presentations and performances, which they would put on sometimes. The town built a bowling alley and a gym in the back. And they built a bandstand next door for musical entertainment. So they really tried to give these guys something to do that was positive and a good experience. So the way this Fort Caswell was set up as a training camp. So the men would come in for a few months and then they would be shipped overseas, and then more men would come in. So it was sort of a turnover. They weren't just living there. And so during that time that they were there, the people of Southport did all they could to make them feel welcome. With the Army-Navy Club, they also would invite them into their homes and give them good home-cooked meals. And these were young guys, they were college-aged or less, and so they would also sometimes give them advice and encouragement and sort of take on a little pseudo-parental role for them as they moved through town. Before they shipped out, they made it a point to get their picture taken on the steps of the Army-Navy Club. It became a tradition that before you left, you got your picture taken there with your buddies, and it was supposed to bring you good luck. So I got curious about some of the letters that they wrote home, and so I started looking around to see if I could find any letters from anybody at Fort Caswell. And I did find a young man that was stationed there that was writing letters home, and he was stationed there for a longer period of time. And he says in some of his letters, gosh darn, I wish I could go to Europe with all my buddies, but instead I'm stuck here because my commander wants me to stay. I don't know if he really wanted to go or if that was just, bravado, but he did say it. And the reason that this man was keeping him there was because he had some skills that he wanted, because he was a photographer. And so he would take pictures of all the incoming troops, he would take pictures of what was going on, and so he was valuable right where he was. So he wrote some letters, he wrote to his girl, they weren't getting along all that well. He didn't feel that she was doing enough for the war effort. But he did think that if she was willing to move down to Southport and maybe share a house with somebody else's girlfriend, and they could both stay there and he could see her on a regular basis, that they could probably work things out, but I don't think she ever did that. He would write to his father and his brother and sister too, but the ones I was most interested in was the letters he wrote to his mother. And it was very sweet because obviously she was worried about him. He would write to her about drinking. He said that it was a dry town, there wasn't anything for people to drink, that some of the men, some of his buddies would drink lemon extract, but that he had tried it and he was not going to be drinking any more lemon extract. She obviously also was worried about torpedoes, so he told her not to worry about that they had these big guns and that there was no way, submarines and torpedoes, that there was no way that any submarine was going to send a torpedo toward them, that they had it. He didn't mention it, but they also had landmines, and that they could put out into the water. They were sort of tethered mines that they could send out, and then they could detonate them from the fort, so that they could, friendly ships could pass through, and then they could also detonate them if there were any enemy ships. And the other thing that he wrote her about was movies. Because movies were a pretty recent invention, and he liked them. And he used to see movies in Southport. And so he would tell her the plots of movies and things he'd seen. And in Southport, we got new movies every couple of days. And because everybody's seen them another time, a couple of days. The movies cost 5 cents or 10 cents, depending on when you saw them. And you could also purchase parched peanuts for snacks. So, does everybody know where the movie theater in town was? Everybody seen it? Everybody seen it? The Amuse-You Theater. Amuse-You. So the original building was built in 1912. The current building, they started building it in 1916. I was looking today on the plaque on the building, it says 1918. I was giving them a little more credit. They started building it in 1916. It took a while to get it done, and that's because we had a big fire in town, the business district. There were some buildings that had burned. So there's a lot of construction going on for those buildings. There was the construction for this. So they started in 1916, but it didn't actually get finished until 1918. So that's why that says that. It was popular, so they expanded it, especially with the military in town. It had benches for seats. It could hold 300 people. There was room for 250 people downstairs, and then there was the gallery upstairs for the African Americans. They could hold 50. One of the first showings at the new theater was a benefit for war sufferers in Europe, and they said that a tidy sum was raised. And then, remember, those movies were not talkies yet. They were still silent movies. And so there was a gentleman named Ron Hood who used to play the piano during the show. And he could really set the moods for the scenes. Lisa, I'm sorry, I am really hot. Is anybody else hot?
Oh, yeah.
Could you? I know we turned it off because it's too cold, but I'm...
All right, we have half and half. People have requested both things of me, so I'm
Okay,
just saying.
should we turn the fans on or should we turn the air? What would...
Put fans.
Whatever fans on. Do you want both fans or one fan?
Fans on.
Okay, you tell me. We can
All right.
turn off, but I... Yeah. It was cold earlier. Okay, so that's the YouTube.
There's one more thing about the
Yeah. What's that? Oh, the Furcless family, yes. So it's been owned by the same family since it started. So it's been owned for over 100 years. Like I said, it says built in 1916, the plaque says 1918. Technically, they're correct. It was finished in 1918. And if anybody doesn't know, it's right next to Port City, Java. And it still is open occasionally for special events and showings and things like that. All right, so my next question is really important. Pay close attention. Does anybody remember Randolph Scott? Yes. Okay, everybody else grew up on Westerns? Okay. Yeah, so Randolph Scott was actually a pretty big movie star. And the reason that I mention him is that when he was 19 years old, in 1917, he was stationed on Caswell, in Fort Caswell. He joined the National Guard, so he was actually there for a whole year before he switched over and went to a different, to the regular military and went over to France for a year. So there's the National Guard troop. This is, he's not 19 here, but it was the youngest picture that I could find of him. Also, he rode horses over in Caswell, so it kind of fit. And I'm just pointing it out because I picture he was here for a year. He was walking around Southport. This is serious eye candy.
Serious eye candy.
So he appeared in more than 100 films during the course of his career. He had a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and in 1997, after he died, he was given the Golden Boot Award to signify the major contributions he made to the genre of westerns. So that led me to start thinking, well, you know, he was 19 years old when he was here. He spent time riding horses. He spent time going to the movies here. Is that when he first started getting the idea that maybe someday he wanted to be a Western star? Did it all start at these movies? One of those questions we just never will know.
Bill will know.
Huh?
Bill will know. Bill Surplus will know.
Let's ask Bill, see if he'll take credit for Randolph Scott's career. I want to mention one other man in town who enlisted in the military, and that was Dr. Dosher. He, at the time the war started, he was 40 years old. He was married. He was a father. He was here as he had a career. He had absolutely no obligation to go to war, but he felt it was his duty to help the troops. So he went over for a year in France and fought over there and became a captain of Dosher. And then he came back to Southport. So this is the Wilmington Newspaper from November 12, 1918, 101 years ago today. And the war was over. After 4 years of war for Europe, about a year and a half for us, it was over. Our first combat troops arrived in June of 2017. And like I said, it was until November of the following year that we were involved in the war. During that period, that year and a half, 53,000 troops were killed in combat. And to give you a gauge for that, in the entire Vietnam War, 57,000 were killed. So in 18 months, less than 18 months was how many were killed in combat. Another 63,000 were killed in non-combat related deaths. And that was largely due to the flu pandemic of 1918. So well over 100,000, mostly men, died. And another 200,000 were injured. So that was larger than the whole military that we had when we started, 200,000, and that many were injured. So even though it was a short war, it was a very brutal war, and those young men that were passing through here were really going to a very dangerous situation. Southport did an excellent job of managing their overnight change to a military town, but they did have support from an organization called the War Camp Community Service. And they didn't provide any funds that I'm aware of, but they provided advice and ideas and best practices from other communities. And they were part of what was called the Playground Association of America, which apparently was focused on recreation and things like that. And built, so there were really, a lot of towns were going through what Southport was going through, and they had this problem, so there was good advice. Following the war, about 2 years after the war, a young man that worked, or I don't know if he's young, but a man that worked at our in Southport for the Community Service organization wrote a book, and the book was called "The Town That Found Itself," and he wrote it about Southport. And I'm just going to read you what that page says. He said, "Once upon a time, a little over 2 years ago, there was a town in our south which was socially poverty-stricken. It was a century and a half old and 60% of its white citizens were members of 5 or 6 families who had lived there for generations. Yet, there were persons who did not know their own cousins living a few rods off. There were various social circles, clannish circles, whose members never met. Religious denominations did not mingle. There was no neighborliness to the town, no spirit of get-together. The people themselves said so. It was the more surprising because the town was isolated by nature and has remained so for lack of good roads. You might think that a community which is visited by a single train and a single little riverboat a day would have learned to become socially self-nourishing, but it had not. Never at any time did the people of the town all get together to talk, to sing, walk, play, dance, listen to entertainment, or to laugh together. In consequence, the town did not know itself. Incidentally, their children did not know how to play games and get fun out of them, which boded ill for the next generation. And thus things have been in this North Carolina town for a long while. So this is where it gets really, and then he goes on to explain how the community service camp saved the town. So, now, did Southport find a common purpose in the war? I think so. It looked like they did. They really pulled together and really helped the troops. But, was it fair to say that before then, the town had no sense of community, nothing, no sense of itself? I don't think so. And this is where, as historians, we can look for other evidence. Sometimes we get really excited when we find something, I do, when it's a contemporary document, because you think, okay, this was written at the time this was happening. So this must be really what was going on. But it's important to remember that even in things that were written at that time, there's always an agenda. And this guy had, he had an agenda. He had done a job, and he wanted to show how great his job was. And what a great job he had done. And that it was going to continue to benefit the town, because obviously that sold the idea of this type of service. But as historians, we can look for other evidence of whether or not this was true. We already talked about the Women's Club. It started a decade before the war came. There were women from Southport working together to beautify the town, to socialize, to come up with things like that. We know that there was the pavilion where people gathered together. We know that there had been a church cookbook published in 1907 from St. Philip's Church to try to support that church. They didn't have enough members to create a whole church cookbook, so women from other denominations had submitted their recipes for this cookbook. It was a common interest that went across denominations. We know that they had worked together, the town worked together to establish prohibition. They worked together to bring the railroad in. We even know from the Rosenblatt School that there were donations from both the black community and also significant donations from the white community. So I think that what we can look at is this is really interesting, and there is some value in this document. There are some tidbits of what was really going on in Southport, but again, to always bear in mind when you're looking at sources, like what is the agenda, what is this person's trying to promote, and then how can I validate this and ensure that I'm looking at a full picture. Did you have something?
I just wanted to add the agenda. The community service organization was trying to continue beyond the war,
right,
and was trying to bring in funding.
Mm-hmm.
So the young man is stating his case of all the good they can do.
Yeah, but it's worthwhile for me because it does describe. Then you find, there was just one boat, there was just one train. There were, there's things that are true in it, but it's just the way he told the truth, but told it slanted. Yes.
Was the author local?
No, he came here for as part of the community service group.
How did the influenza epidemic affect Southport?
That's something that I've been wanting to research. I'm not sure how badly it did, because you've got, on one hand, it's isolated, which helps, but then you've got the troops coming in, and they were coming from other places. So, I thought of looking to see in the cemeteries, the records, to see if we see an increase in 1918.
Well, I just wondered if maybe that would have occurred contemporaneous with his arrival. He's only here for a short period of time, and they probably took precautions to minimize contagion.
Yeah, I'm not sure, too, they knew too much how things were past. But yeah, I mean, when the troops would first come in, I know they would isolate them. When the troops came in, they were isolated from the rest of the troops, which might have helped. You know, a lot of what was spreading it was, you know, being passed from other areas, so I don't know. It also could come in on boats, so. But I haven't ever read a lot about it affecting Southport. Bob, have you?
What
I think it was.
all I've read is the statements to the effect that the town was not greatly impacted.
Yeah,
let's say,
that was
by-
my impression. And we always have this solution.
Even through the Civil War, you know, they talked about Wilmington lost, what, 20% of its population?
Yellow fever.
Again, the same statements of Southport was not impacted, but not greatly.
And that was definitely the Silvery's freezers because it blew the mosquitoes away. Flu would be harder to rationalize. All right, so any other questions? Yeah.
This community service organization, has it evolved into anything?
They ran,
They ran the USOs, right?
they ran, you know, yeah, the Army Navy Club.
Right, but I didn't know if they also came around with the USOs. They probably were involved in that 20, 30 years later. I'm not sure. I'd never heard of them before this.
They had the quarantine station too, that helped with when it started with the influenza. Didn't they start that with the boats?
The quarantine station actually started long before that. It was for yellow fever from the boats coming in from the tropics, the
Right.
islands.
So, and how long was it open? Do you remember?
Dr.
Through
Cooper's was the
1930.
last one, right?
In the 1930s.
1930s.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to take a 6-minute break. And I've got
Liz, could we tell them that we have some sugar cake and we're ready to cookies back here?
We do. We have one.
Well, I'll tell them that.
These are great.
They are. This is ginger spice.
Are your cords reach
You'll
to
see
the
it's
plug
really
behind you?
thinly rolled.
I think so.
People can do that.
So within 2 days, we were at war with everybody and everybody was at war with us. So you probably know all that. But what you might not know is that 3 months later, a Nazi U-boat torpedoed and sank an oil tanker right off the coast of Southport. Now, some of you might be thinking, because this is what I thought when I first heard this, that is so random. I mean, what are the odds that this little town, and then there's, you know, an oil tanker that gets torpedoed? That just seems, you know, how likely could that be? Well, actually pretty likely. The odds were pretty high that that would happen. Last week we learned that parts of North Carolina were known as the moonshine capital of the world. The waters off of North Carolina had their own nickname, and that was Torpedo Junction. Not a good nickname to have earned. Now, even though the Japanese and the Germans had an alliance, it was sort of a loose arrangement. And so, which is actually good for us. The Germans were taken by surprise by the attack on Pearl Harbor. They did not know that that was coming. If they had, they might have coordinated an attack and attacked us on the East Coast at the same time that they were attacking us in the Pacific, and we really would have been in trouble. But they didn't know about it. But they responded very quickly and realized how they could use it to their advantage. So while we were focused on Japan and the Pacific, they decided to come to the Atlantic. And so they started sending U-boats over. And what their goal was to attack supply ships that were especially oil tankers. That was their primary target, was oil tankers over 10,000 tons was what they really wanted. And they called this Operation Drumbeat, which some people translate it as Drumble. So it would take the subs 2 weeks to make the journey across, and then they would have enough ammunition and supplies to spend about 2 weeks attacking boats, and then they still have enough fuel left to make their journey home, which would take them about 2 weeks. So that was kind of how they did it. So the goal was to disrupt our shipping lanes. So we were bringing lots and lots of oil up from Venezuela and from Texas and from the Dutch West Indies, and we would bring this all around, and you can see where it all starts to converge is along the eastern seaboard and along North Carolina. So that was, and the water was deep there. It was a good place for submarines, and so that was where a lot of the attacks took place. They felt, and they were probably right, if they could cut off that supply of oil, we really needed that. We needed it for ourselves, we needed it for the military. So if they could cut it off, it would shut the military down, it would shut all of our factories down, and many people would freeze to death. And so we would be forced out of the war. So there's some major differences between submarines as we think of them today and U-boats. U-boats were actually meant to travel on the surface. They didn't travel on the water the way you think of like nuclear subs today. They ran on the surface because that's when they could use their diesel engines. They could go faster, and they operated better that way. Underwater, they were operating on battery power, so it couldn't last very long. The main reason that they would submerge would be to hide from boats and planes and to avoid bad weather. But they could only travel about 60 miles underwater. They were pretty slow, and they would also run out of oxygen. They could only stay submerged for about an hour before they ran out of oxygen. So it really wasn't their primary mode. What they would do is, and to attack, they preferred to be on the surface. So, because they could be seen when they were on the surface, they preferred to attack at night. So that's when most of the attacks happened. So when the U.S. entered, England had been at war with Germany for a couple of years. They had been dealing with U-boats, so they had some experience. And so they gave advice on how to handle them. They said, your merchant ships should travel in convoys. They shouldn't travel by themselves. Preferably they should be escorted with military boats. And they should avoid normal shipping lanes. They should, zigzag back and forth so they're harder targets to hit. They confuse the submarines. And you should black out the cities along the coast, because otherwise the boats are silhouetted against the lights from the cities. And the U.S. didn't do any of that. So at the beginning of the war, they didn't feel like they had enough ships to escort the boats. They were holding them either for the Pacific, or they felt they needed them for surface fighting. But they didn't have ships, they just didn't use them for that. They also didn't enforce blackouts. They requested blackouts for the coastal towns, but most of them said, I'm afraid that's going to hurt tourism. So, and we could lose money if we turn off the lights. And so they didn't. And so despite all the warnings from the British, it just appeared that the U.S. really didn't understand the threat of the U-boats, and it put many ships and many lives at risk. When you start looking at the numbers of the ships that were sunk, it starts to not be so surprising that a ship was torpedoed right offshore. And I would be surprised if you didn't know that there were this many attacks. I didn't know there were this many attacks. I certainly didn't. And part of the reason that you might not have known about it is that the U.S. military and government authorities did their best to keep the attacks quiet. They didn't want people to panic. And so news reports of enemy U-boats were near the coast were classified and were held back from the public for national security reasons. And so for many years, people had no idea how bad things really were. And the news media went along with the government censorship for the sake of the war. So it helped people hide it. And of course, again, so isolated. No TV, no radio, no internet. People, weren't taking their own cell phone videos and uploading them to show people what was going on. People really only got their information from those official sources. When the Germans got here, they didn't know what they were going to meet. When they headed off, they didn't know what kind of defense they were going to be hitting from the Americans. They just thought it was worth the risk. But when they got here, they were amazed at our lack of preparation and defense. So the official name of this plan was Operation Drumbeat or Operation Drumroll, but the German submariners had their own nicknames for it. They called it the Happy Time. The Golden Time, and the American Shooting Gallery.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
They have the names of the ship that was sunk, but they also have the name of the U-boat that sunk. How would they know which U-boat sunk? Any idea?
Because the U-boats kept records and they sent them up to command. And so then after the war, not a lot of their records, they were
I see.
poured
So it
through.
was after the fact that they got.
Yeah, a lot of times it was after the fact, based on what the U-boats had reported.
There's a monument on Bay Street there that's part of the city.
Yeah, the Historical Society put that up, we'll be talking about that. So the situation began to change on the 1st of April. Finally, the military started to do something. What they did was they told the ships not to travel at night. So they said, if you're going to travel, go from safe harbor to safe harbor during the day, get away before nighttime. So that was something that helped a little bit. And then in the middle of May, they started doing some convoys. So they did it from Hampton Roads down to Key West, and then they started from Boston up north, and they would meet up with the British convoy up there. So they started doing some convoys, which also helped. But in the first 6 months of 1942, U-boat attacks destroyed 22% of the tanker fleet and sank 233 ships in the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico. Just enough, just first period. They killed 5,000 seamen and passengers in the Atlantic. And that's more than twice the number that perished at Pearl Harbor. You never hear about it. And in the waters off of North Carolina, just off of North Carolina, they sunk more than 80 cargo ships and 1,600 lives were lost. So finally they started doing full convoys, and that produced a reduction because it was harder to attack the ships. The submarines were going to get attacked in retaliation if they did. And so some of the U-boats started to get some. The Germans really had very few U-boats. They couldn't afford to lose a whole bunch of them. But I think, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like 20. And they really, only a few boats did all of this damage. So by July, they stopped the whole heavy attack. They still occasionally you would have a boat sunk, but not to the level that it was during that period, during the American Shooting Gallery. So there have been experts that have described the German U-boats as among the most effective and seaworthy warships ever designed. I don't know, but that's what they said. They've also said that the campaign's impact on the supply chain in the U.S. constituted a greater strategic setback for the Allied war effort than did the defeat at Pearl Harbor. And that in terms of U.S. raw resources and material, it was the costliest defeat of World War II. So that gives you the background of what was going on. And now we'll talk about the John D. Gill, which was the ship that was torpedoed off of Southport.
You said the U-boats ran on diesel?
Yes.
Did the Germans send over their own supply ships for the diesel?
The submarines carried enough fuel to go out and come back. They were on a very tight schedule. They were very crammed. When you see pictures of when they first started, they had all the fuel, and then they had the food, they had ammunition, they had everything. They were just kind of squeezed in and among around everything. They had to keep everything with them and back. So this is the John D. Gill. It was out only on its second voyage when it was hit. A couple days before, or the day before, on March 11, it pulled into Charleston. There was a Coast Guard ordered stop because some planes had spotted what they thought was a submarine shadowing. So they said, you better pull in. So the next afternoon, they were given all clear. It's like, all right, you can continue on your way. They were on their way to Philadelphia to a refining company there. The crew was worried. This was their second voyage. On their first voyage, they had actually stopped and picked up survivors from another boat that had been torpedoed. So there was 25 people that they picked up. So it was very real to them. They had talked to them. They knew what had happened. They knew the dangers that were out there. They were very nervous. And this is the German U-boat. The U-boat 158. And it was on its first voyage as part of this Operation Drumbeat. On March 11th, it sank a ship off of St. John's in Newfoundland, and then it started moving down the east coast. So it had come across. They weren't supposed to do anything until they got over here because they were trying to have the element of surprise, and then they started attacking the east coast. 2 days later, they were 20 miles offshore of Southport, and they encountered the gill, which met their criteria. It was over 10,000 tons. Following their attack on the gill, they sank one more ship, and they damaged one more before they had to turn around and head back to Germany. So the torpedo from the German sub hit the John D. Gill amidship, and it just tore. There's like heavy metal plates the ship was made of. It just tore them apart like a flower pot. And the Gill was carrying over 140,000 barrels of West Texas crude oil, and it had a very high gasoline content. So when the torpedo struck the boat, it just came out like a geyser because there were millions of gallons pushing behind it. It all came out and made this oil slick around the boat. Within a minute, the slick coated the sea, and then a minute or so later, it all erupted into flame. And there were 58 men on the boat, all suddenly scrambling to save their lives, but only 26 of them were make it. This is Herbert Gardner. He was 22 years old in March of 1942. He worked on the John D. Gill. He was on a merchant marine. He was a wiper, and that meant that he did like general cleaning and stuff. He was pretty much below everything on the totem pole, and he did any other kinds of tasks that were assigned. And that night, about 10 o'clock that night, he was sitting in the mess. He was having a cup of coffee, and he was wondering what he would do if his ship was torpedoed. And about 10 minutes later, he got this. He said when it hit, it was like it picked the chair up and moved it out from underneath me, just crashed on the floor. And he said he knew right away what had happened. And then just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. Because someone out on the deck, whether they saw somebody out in the water and thought that they were going to throw them a life preserver to help, or whether they thought they would need a life preserver once people started, going over, getting off the ship, that they wouldn't do any good. For whatever reason, someone threw a life preserver into the water. And the problem with that is that the life preservers had on them a self-igniting fuse, like a flare. And when it hit the water, it ignited, and all of that oil that was out there just burst into flames. So Mr. Gardner, he rushed to a lifeboat. But, so he got in the lifeboat, and some other people got in the lifeboat, and they started lowering themselves. But suddenly the boat dropped underneath them, okay? So a couple of men went down to the boat, down to the water level. He and another man were holding onto the ropes, and so they continued to hold onto the ropes. They were swinging from the side of the ship. The ones who went down with the boat, when it hit the water, it capsized. And the ship's screws were still turning at that point. So those men got pulled into the screws. And he watched that happen, and he's clinging to the ropes, for all his life. The other man was also, but the other man was not as strong. And he wanted to help him, but he couldn't reach him, he couldn't hold him. And then a minute or so later, he realized he was all alone, just hanging there on the ship. And he said, 50 years later, that still haunted him, that he was unable to save any of his other men. So he hung on, he kept holding on. Eventually, the screws stopped turning. And at that point, then he did drop into the water. When he got there, he saw one of the Filipino mess boys. There were two on the ship, and he thought it was a man named Kevin Tonsil, who they called Benny. He was sitting in the half-sunk lifeboat, and he was just in shock, and he was just saying, no. He tried to get him to swim with him, but he wasn't able to get him to focus. He was just kind of out of it and in shock. So eventually he gave up. He realized he just needed to save himself. And so he started swimming. So he was wearing a life preserver. He had a cork life preserver. And so he started swimming, but the ocean was on fire. So he couldn't just swim through the flames. So he actually was able to dive beneath the flames and start swimming, which is really hard to do. But he said when you're scared enough, you can do anything. But as he's swimming, he can't see from underneath where the flames are. So he would periodically, when he need more air, he'd come up and he would come up in the flames. And his hair was on fire, his hands were on fire, there was oil everywhere. So he was getting it on himself, he can't come up. And then he'd go back under and he would try. So he multiple times he finally managed to get out of the oil and the flames and get as clear as related to the ship. So it's important to remember, Mr. Gardner, he was not in the military. This was a merchant ship. These were civilians that were just working, doing their job. They were just moving oil. They were not in the military. But each of the ships had a small group of military, team of military that were on the ship, that were, their job was to try and protect the ship, for what that was worth. So this was Seaman Floyd Reddy and Seaman Gary Potts, and they actually were asleep in their bunks when the torpedo hit. They scrambled to the stern where their gun was. It was a 5-inch 51 caliber breech loader cannon, which means it was like 5-inch shells, and the gun was 51 inches long. And all 5 members of the gun crew made it to their post. And newspaper reports said that they stayed there for 15 minutes trying to get off a shot. After everybody else had abandoned ship. So 15 minutes after everybody else had left the ship, these guys stayed on. And Mr. Potts over there, he said, we really wanted to at least get one shot off. He said, but even if the sub had come up, they don't know whether it did or not, they couldn't see it because of the flames. I mean, it was pitch black, and then there were all these flames, they couldn't see anything. So they just kept swinging the gun back and forth, trying to look for something that they could shoot. And they stayed until they saw that the flames were coming closer and closer, and then they saw their ammunition box began to bubble. And so when the officer in charge, when he saw the paint starting to burn on the box, blister on that, he basically said, let's get the hell out of here. And so they all decided they had done their duty and they really needed to leave. So they ran to their life raft. Their life raft, it was in flames. There were no life rafts left on the boat. So they jumped over the railing. And Mr. Ray said they didn't have any other choice. And Mr. Potts said, he said he didn't, the military tells you to jump because it's safer, right? You don't want to dive into something because you're going to hit with your head. But he said he didn't jump, he dove. He said when he was growing up, he used to dive off of railroad bridges. And he said he wasn't thinking about the Navy. He just did what came natural to him and he dove. And he later was glad that he did that because as he was diving, his feet hit the side of one of the lifeboats that was capsized in the water. If he had, it just nicked it and he went on into the water. If he had jumped straight in from where he was standing, he would have gone into the lifeboat, he would have broken his legs and he would not have been able to get away. So he felt that was part of what saved his life. Okay, those were those two men. Then, when the ship was hit, this was the Edwin Cheney. He was the ship's quartermaster. He was 24 years old. He had managed to drop a life raft into the water at the edge of burning oil, not too far from where the flames were. And he was able to push it out of the flames by going underneath it. He went underneath it and swam from there, just came up periodically for air, and managed to push it out of the flames. Then once he got it out of the flames, then he started calling to other survivors to come, it was dark and flames they couldn't see, calling to them to come and get on his raft with him. When they would get there, if they were too weak, he would haul them onto the raft, even though he was very burned, his ears and his hands, and he was very burned, but he helped all these people. Most of the men that survived had third-degree burns on their heads and their arms, their faces. Mr. Gardner, the one who had been in the mess, wondering what would I do if we were hit, he vomited for nearly 2 hours because he had so much oil and seawater in his stomach. During the night, Mr. Potts and Mr. Cheney, so Mr. Potts was the one that Dolan and Mr. Cheney, the ship's quartermaster, they pulled the Filipino cook into the water. And he was burned so bad and he was freezing to death. So Mr. Kotz gave him his life preserver, and hoping that that would give him a little bit more to keep him warm. But later on, Mr. Kotz kind of suffered from having done that. So they were on this raft. The ship was over there. It was burning. It kept exploding. It was sinking. But what they noticed was that the heat and the ship sinking was pulling the raft backwards towards the ship, and that if they didn't do something, they were going to end up going down with the ship. Their raft was going to catch on fire, and they were going to sink. So they realized that they needed to row out of there. There were oars with the life craft, but they realized that there were no oar locks, so they couldn't make any momentum. So what they ended up doing was they turned themselves into human oar locks, and so they put themselves across the raft and clung to the boards, and then they put the oars under their stomachs, and they gave enough resistance that they could row, paddle against that resistance. So they managed to get themselves far enough away so that they didn't go down. But like Mr. Cheney, when he actually took off his life preserver, took off his shirt, his stomach was just completely black from being so bruised. And Mr. Potts, who had given his life preserver away, actually suffered internal damage because of the oars, the motion of the oars on his stomach. So for the rest of the night, the men just clung to the raft, kept moving it as far, trying to keep it away, and they watched their ship die. And it just kept burning and burning, and then it would explode and blow up until it finally just blew itself to pieces. On shore, in Southport, people could watch what was happening. So they stood on shore, and they could see the fire and the smoke, and just watched helplessly from shore. So all the men I talked about, Cheney, Gardner, Reddy, Potts, and then 7 other men that were on that raft with them, were all picked up at 7 o'clock the next morning by the Coast Guard, and they were taken to Southport. They had spent 9 hours in the water. 2 hours after they were picked up, the Johnny Gill sank. The men there had been a lifeboat, so there was that raft, and then there was also a lifeboat that had managed to escape, and there were men in that lifeboat as well. They were picked up by a sister ship of the John D. Gill, so it belonged to the same company as the John D. Gill, just like they picked up some survivors. That ship picked them up and took them with that ship down to Charleston. And unfortunately, 7 months later, that ship was actually torpedoed and sunk by a U-boat. So the 11 injured men and 16 casualties were brought ashore in Southport, and they laid them out actually on the ground at the waterfront near Max Cafe. Southport didn't have an ambulance, and it only had one hearse. So call went out for anybody that had a Woody station wagon, one of these, to come and help transport the wounded and the dead. Survivors were brought to Brunswick County Hospital, and there was a woman named Josephine Hickman. She was a volunteer Red Cross nurse at the hospital when the survivors were brought in. And the Red Cross nurses had just finished their training. It was the first training, I think, that had been done in North Carolina, and they had just finished it. She said, "We didn't think even half of them hardly could live. They were so burned, almost to a crisp and covered with oil. Some of them were burned so bad that the bandages were all over their heads. Only their mouths were open. You just fed them in between the bandages." The hospital staff worked 20 hours straight to stay tending to the men. There were only 5 trained nurses, and the rest were Red Cross volunteers. And she said, "We barely got in our training when this tanker was torpedoed offshore, and here we were faced with this terrible tragedy, but we managed to save every one of them." Everyone that had been injured.
So none of the fishermen went out to try to save these men? They waited till the Coast Guard came?
Yeah, I think they didn't know. I mean, there was a submarine out there. It was dark at night. And, yeah, the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard. I mean, the Coast Guard went as soon as they could. So. So, once their health began to improve, people of Southport donated clothes, shoes, cigarettes, whatever they needed in order to be comfortable and to be able to return to their own homes. The 16 casualties were brought to the local funeral home, and there was a man named Joseph S. Laughlin. He was 15 when this happened. His father was the manager of the hospital, and everybody was drafted to help, and his father pulled him in to help, and he helped carry the dead to the funeral home, which was very different than what 15-year-olds would be today. 7 men were never recovered. So among the dead was Benny Tonsil, the mess boy that had last been seen in the capsized lifeboat. So the majority of the people, the casualties, were able to be returned to their homes for burials. But Tonsil was Filipino, and so his country was under occupation by the Japanese. So there was no way to return his body to his home for burial. So,
in the cemetery here, are they buried here?
Pardon me?
Are they buried in the cemetery?
Well, almost everybody was able to be sent home. They knew who they were. They worked for the refinery. They were U.S. Citizens. So they sent them home. The other shipmates helped identify them. But because he was from the Philippines, they couldn't send him home. So yes, they did bury him in Southport. The people of Southport buried him in Northwood Cemetery. Several ministers came together to perform the ceremony. The Boy Scout troop came out in uniform to salute him and pay respects. And according to the newspapers, the grave was covered with flowers. On April 11, 1943, there was a joint resolution of Congress that authorized the Merchant Marine Distinctive Service Medal. Because remember, these men were not in the military. They were civilians doing their jobs. It was to be awarded in the name of the president, but the first award was personally presented by FDR. And so on October 1st, 1943, he presented it to Edwin Cheney, ship's quartermaster of the SS John D. Gill. And the citation read, "He released and launched a life raft from a sinking and burning ship and maneuvered it through a pool of burning oil to clear water by swimming underwater, coming up only to breathe. Although he had incurred severe burns about the face and arms in this action, he then guided 4 of his shipmates to the raft and swam to and rescued 2 others who were injured and unable to help himself." So remember, he wasn't in the military, he had no military training, he just did this. So,
Back to that last picture, the funeral parlor, is that building stone?
yes it is, we'll see it on our tour today. So you may be wondering what happened to, if the weather holds. You may be wondering what happened to U-158. So the captain and crew returned home from their first voyage to a hero's welcome. They had sunk 3 ships, they damaged a 4th, that was pretty good. A few weeks later, they went out on a second mission, and this time they sank 9 more U.S. and Allied ships. But then on June 30th, about 3 months after they had sunk the John D. Gill, their luck ran out. So while they were in the waters of Bermuda, they were spotted by a U.S. aircraft. Lieutenant R.E. Shredder of Patrol Squadron 74 was flying a patrol bomber Mariner. He was 600 miles east of Southport when he saw U-158 floating in the water. The sub was on the surface, getting a little oxygen, a little break, and there were men on top of the ship, and they were caught totally by surprise. So they were still on the surface when the first depth charge was dropped. The plane then swung around for another strike. This time the charge actually hit the submarine. So with the depth charges, they didn't really hit, they just hit the water, but it hit the submarine. They saw it hit. The charge embedded in the shell of the submarine. So they were in the middle of doing like an emergency dive. At this point, they'd gotten everybody into the boat. They were trying to dive. The depth charge hit them. So as they dove, they basically took their depth with them, because when they got down to the appropriate depth, the charge exploded right on. The plane circled the area for several hours and saw no survivors. I was able to find the actual report that Lieutenant Shredder sent to the government, letting them know about this attack. And he included drawings in the report. So these are his drawings of when we first saw the ship, and then when we came across it, and then when we dropped the first bomb, and he's even like, this was this heavyset man, I think he was the captain. So he sent in those drawings. Apparently that was not standard, because they sent back a note saying that the drawing was really good. It really helped a lot for us to understand what was going on. So it was just something that he did, but I was amazed that I could find those out there. As you were saying, there is a monument to John D. Gill, to Captain Newton and all of the men on the John D. Gill. And it was erected by the Southport Historical Society in March 1994, which is 52 years after the sinking of the John D. Gill. It's a gray granite stone. It sits on the lawn of the garrison. It overlooks the horizon where the tanker burned and sank, and where the people of Southport anxiously watched and waited to help. This was a picture from the ceremony when they established commemorated the marker, and there were members of the Coast Guard and Merchant Marine that were there, veterans there, and also some of the survivors of the SS John D. Gill came. So this was put together by the Southport Historical Society. And here are the three men that came to the thing. It was 52 years later, so there were only a few people still left. But Floyd Reddy, Herbert Gardner, and Gary Potts all made the trip. They all traveled to Southport that day. And later, they sent thank you notes from the men and their families saying that they, for saving Southport, for saving their lives in the first place, and then also making them feel like they had a second home in Southport. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions about the John D. Gill? We will next week, not this week, but next week we will be walking over and seeing the monument as part of our little field trip next week.
That's interesting.
So, researching nearby history, we have all the things that we had talked about before, including contemporary documents. So we have the booklet that was written by the service camp, the war camp service people, and we also have the actual reports from the attack on the U-boat from the men who actually did the attack, their actual corporate report. So those are the type of things for contemporary documents. And then as far as exploring, the things we've added are old photos are always helpful, and then cemeteries and memorials are another thing to explore to find out more. I will be sending you an email with more information, and then once we, clean the room up, put the chairs back, then we'll be going on a tour, unless it's cold and raining out there. We're going to go on a walking tour. So about half, I'm trying to figure out where's half and half. Lost with people. I don't know. Right down. On the right. No, we'll be on the left. This half of the room goes with me, and this half of the room goes with Bob. Does that work? Okay. And we're just going to clean up, and then we'll head out. It's about half a mile. If you're not up to it, I will send it out. If it's a list of locations in my lead.
Yeah.